Hello, I hope you all have a good day or night. I am Loki the Witful. About 2 weeks ago, I built Photon Tic Tac in Angeldust. It was a great project. I think it took about 3 days to build the machine and then about an extra day just, putting a video together to show it off. I had so much fun though, building and making the video. I wanted to do one more thing before I said I was done with it. So I thought, let's do one more video, a breakdown, explaining of how it works and how all the parts inside of it work. And to do this, I took the world chunk file and exported it to Blender. Luckily, Angeldust has this very unique feature where you can export any chunk into a polymesh file and open up in any 3D application that supports polymesh files. And if you want to export your own chunk into a polymesh file and put it into any 3D application, you can go to playangeldust.com, go into the forums, look for dev Angeldust Creator Kit, download the Creator Kit, and it'll tell you how to do it. Or you can go to Angeldust Dev 4 off the map and he'll show you how to do it. And to start the breakdown, I removed everything that we don't need, the casing around it, so we're just left with the photon, screen, memory, and WinLogic, buttons, reset system, stuff like that, etc. So let's first remove everything and look at the buttons component because it's the first major component of where everything happens and how it works. This is X side and X is now ready to move so they step on the pressure pad that's going to be highlighted here. The photon pad transmits to 2 different locations when it's stepped on. For one, the photon MIG, which is a button where it can change its state to different bricks. The first state is set to the transparent sticker where it has no collisions and it's completely invisible. 2, the second state is a metal grate as a cap to prevent the button being stepped on again. The third state is set to the same thing as the second state. 2, it transmits to the photon conduit, which is underneath it, or known as photon wiring for photons. Now the photon travels down through the conduit through the photon block. The photon block can change its state from a hollow transparent state to a glowing state. When it's in the hollow transparent state, photons can pass freely through it. But when a photon does this, it changes its state to the glowing state, or where it's no longer passable. This acts as a second protection for griefing, so 2 stars can't pass through it at once. So then it continues down through it to the faucet, which spawns a photon ball that falls onto the next pressure pad, activating the next step. This photon pad transmits to 3 different locations. 1, the turn flip-flop, what takes care of the turn, we'll be explaining in a little bit. The course also transmits to the corresponding button relay, what is the photon block that we just activated on this side. Thirdly, it transmits to the photon faucet, what will drop the photon ball that we'll be explaining in a little bit. As you can quickly see, the corresponding button relay is on the other side, making it the corresponding button relay. And to go back to explain that photon ball, the photon ball will travel down the conveyor belt until it reaches start. This is more of a timer to keep a delay going for the other step, the in-between steps to happen that will now be explained. The turn flip-flopper is the new component we're going to want to look at. This makes it where anyone can make their turn and be first, so it doesn't matter X or O, whoever makes the first move is the first player. This component works by receiving signals from both sides. So the first signal is received from S, from the button. It hits the conduit and travels directly down through the photon block. The photon block changes its state to an on state so it can no longer travel directly through. Why? Because the photon faucet's underneath it. When the photon star passes by it, it activates the faucet, spawning a photon ball that will fall onto the pressure pad. Because now it's on, this will never happen again until it's needed. Later on will be explained. But what we need to focus on now is the photon ball that fell on the pad. The pad transmits to the master cap lock, or the button spam protection system. The spam protection system is actually located by the buttons, but we're going to be changing views to make it a little easier to see the pads. Now that it has received its signal, photon pads can transmit to up to 4 different locations at once. That is the max amount. So it transmits to the first 3 major locations. The photon mimics, which turn on the cap lock, making it where you can't spam the button. The first 3 are highlighted in orange. The 4th location is to the other side, master lock. What will we continue the pass through and demonstrate. Continuing to send 4 different signals down the line, it keeps on going until it gets the last one, which only transmits to 3 different locations. Now we go back to the photon ball that spawned on step 3. It finally made it to the end of its timer destination, which actually only took about 3 seconds to happen. So now the photon ball lands on the pad and continues to the next step, which is to transmit 3 signals to 2 different major locations. First, 2 signals travel to memory and win logic. Third, Bluewood or / known as screen. Now we're basically done with the button systems for the explaining. There's a little bit more to know, but we don't need to know that until later. So let's take one final look at it before we continue on to the next component, etc. That is going to be memory and win logic. We have X and O memory win logic, where I'm pulling up right now. We have O and X. We don't need both. We're only going to look at X, so we hide O. Then we dissect X to show what we just basically need to know currently at this moment. And that is memory, the stored value, so we know if we have 3 in a row or not. To store this memory, we use photon blocks. They can change state and they're perfect for storing memory types or values. I'll explain how in a little bit. I did make one little error. I forgot to save the chunk file with the photon block, so they're in off status right now. Don't worry, I'll fill it in for visual aid. All the white ones are highlighted, they're on. The signal it received from the button turns the 2 off so that they're no longer on. This acts as stored memory, so it knows there's a move made right where it is. But why transmit to 2 different locations? Because one represents horizontal and vertical memory, and the back one, or the X plus looking sign, is diagonal memory, which is very important. We don't need to really know anything else on how it works. We just need to know it stores memory at this current moment. So let's go to the next transmission location, the Bluewood / screen location. Continuing from step 14, it receives the signal from the button to the one where the arrow is pointing at. This is X draw system. We'll transmit the drawing of the X. Now that it's received its signal, it's able to transmit to 4 different locations. The first 3 location is to the photons that act as screen. It draws the first 3 dots that make up the X. The 4th location into the second part of writing the screen, which is the last 2 dots. As you can see now, it looks like an X, but also it transmits to the memory and win logic. Now we're done with the Bluewood area, so we don't really need to look at the Bluewood stuff or the things on it. We will come back to the rest of it later. What we need to go back to is the memory. The memory, as we know, stores the value, but the value is not technically, we don't know enough on how it works yet. So we know it stored the value, but how does it continue with this value? How it does it, we need to add a new component, the cyan energy or check win function. It receives from the Bluewood or / screen area to check for the win. It checks for win by sending a photon down through the conduit, through that photon block that was just turned off. But we know now that photon block is turned on, so we need to go a little bit more before we continue on the trail of this photon. To do this, we are going to need to turn around and look at the back in between side of it. And we're going to need to add a new component to the memory and check win logic now. This will be the 3rd component, but there'll be a lot more. Let me try to angle myself. It's a little difficult trying to get to the right angle to show what component we're adding, but it's very necessary that this component is added. It is if true stasis, which is this little component in the back, the little pad and the photon faucet. Now that the memory is no longer accurate because it's on, we need to turn it back off. Because the photon passed by the faucet, it spawns the photon ball. The photon ball lands onto the pad, activating the next step. The pad transmits back into the photon block, turning it not on, making the memory now accurate. Now that it's off, we need to go back to the original journey of the original photon. Now it continues down to the end of its journey, what is a photon block that is in its on stasis. Normally, this will be where it stops because it hits it and it just despawns because it hits a blank wall. So we need to add another component to make it continue through the steps. This new component is the if not win system. It's a lot of pieces, but trust me, it's quite simple once you know. I'm going to try to angle it and give you more explanation how it works. The photon continues down and hits the photon block, which is in its on stasis. Well, that would have been the end, but this new component changes that because it's on an L angle. When the photon hits the on photon block, it acts as a wall and acts as a turn signal. Instead of ending, it turns and redirects it into the photon faucet, which spawns a photon ball that falls onto the photon pad, which then transmits to the next step location. It checks for the next win. It continues checking win. I'm going to zoom out and give you a more visual basis on how all the check for win combinations happen. It continues doing this. All those pressure pads are wired into the direct one, and it continues doing this until every combination is tested. This is not the most efficient way to check for win, but it's the way I designed it to check for the win. Until it gets to the back side or the diagonal side, those are not wired into any more check wins because it's checked for every win combination. So instead, it transmits to the O button. So we now have to go back to the button component. So now I have to quickly reopen the O button, the button side, and we go look at O side instead of X. So we angle ourselves right so we can get a good view and understanding of how this works and why. It receives the signal from memory and win logic to the O turn off cap button. As we know, all the caps are on, so now we have to turn those caps off. This command will turn off specifically all the O caps. It turns off all the O caps by using the photon remover. The remover is like the negative pulse. If photon stars are the on pulse, it's the negative pulse. Negative pulse automatically returns it to zero stasis, so it transmits to 4 major locations. The 3 photon mimics above the first 3 buttons into the next off sequence, which that arrow is pointing to as the 4th. Now with a little bit zoomed out angle, we can see it continues to do this repeating process of sending 4 transitions until it gets to the very end where it sends the last 3, and that is technically the end stasis of it. Now we know how this works. We still need to know a little bit more about the turn flip-flop. So let's repeat the process but say O is making their turn. So we continue through the same turn process until we get back to the turn flip-flop, where things change up a little bit. It receives the photon signal from the photon button. But this time things are a little bit different because the photon block is on and it's receiving from O, so it's just one different location. But the step process is the same just for like as if it was for X. So let me get you a better angle to see what's happening. The photon travels down the conduit, but because the photon block is on, it hits it and ricochets upward instead, spawning the photon ball off the faucet. The photon ball falls down onto the photon pad, activating the next step to transmit to the O button again. Well, we're pretty much now done with the turn flip-flop. Now we know how it works, so let's take one final look at it and go back to the button. O side receives the transmission, but instead to the photon remover, it receives it to the photon injector next to the remover. This is the master cap to lock all of O's side back down. So now the whole board is recapped with the photon mimics above the buttons. In the same sequence, it removes them, it puts the caps back on. And then the whole memory and storing value and checking for win is repeated. So now we go on to stage 2. What if there's a win condition? So we'll see how it works. Skipping through all the turn systems and repeating the process, let's just say X made a victory. 3 across the bottom. So the photon is able to travel through from the psi energy all the way to the other side. From the step 17, it returns off the conditions to make sure it's happened just in case if the last block was not on. So it protects it from false memory. Either way, the photon ball spawns and lands on the pad, activating the victory sequence. It transmits the victory sequence over to the screen portion of the components. So now we're done with the memory and win logic. It now has transmitted over to the screen, but let's take one final look at the memory and win logic before we go over to the screen component and explain on how it works and draws the victory line and etc., all the extra stuff. From the memory and win logic system, it receives it into the photon stack with the little half-slab lantern on top of it. This acts as the line drawing system. I made the image a little bit bigger. The white, blue highlighted with blue lines are the photon transmitter or injectors, and the one with the black on top is going to be our lantern block. So the first one it received it to transmits to 3 different locations. The little one the blue arrow is pointing to is being our photon mimics turning into gold blocks. It sends the transmission 3 transitions to those 3 individual bricks. I just couldn't fit the arrow to make it look like it was shooting 3. The fourth signal is to the one underneath it, where this process will be repeated, transmitting down through the screen until the whole thing is actually filled out. And then the last one transmits to the counter-responding side on the right side, which does drawing the screen on the other side for O. Now that has drawn the wind line, you think we'll be done, but we're not actually quite done yet. We need to go into stage 3, the reset. What helps so we can play the game again. So we need to go look at one more new component, something we neglected, the reset button. The reset button is located on the right bottom side of each player's side. The reset button transmits to 3 different locations. 1, to the other reset button cap. 2, to its own reset button cap. And 3, the master relay reset. Where is the master relay reset? Well, it's under O's side at the very back, right here. We were using O's button to demonstrate. These is a part of the reset system. Let's look at the reset relay. Reset relay is highlighted with the half slab over it of the pipe draining block. It receives it from the reset button and will continue to resend it to the new location that will be shown. We are looking at it from the top angle now, with the reset relay at the bottom middle of the screen, and what actually is the button relay is at the top middle of the screen. So it receives the signal and transmits to the 3 button relays underneath it, and then it sends the 4th signal to the one underneath it and continues on so on until all the button relays are reset, when the last transmission is sent to memory and win logic reset. The memory and win logic reset, I took off all the pieces so we can just see the memory so we can get a better look at how it works. It transmits to the water block, or the memory reset first step. This first step is actually the photon remover, the negative pulse, what automatically turns it off. So it sends 3 major locations, the memory bank, the 3 at the very bottom. The 4th location is to the brick under it so it can continue the process. Then it continues doing this, sending 3 to the next ones above it and the one underneath it, continuing through the steps. It continues through all these steps until the entire memory has been cleaned and emptied. Until it gets to the last state, which transmits to the smoke block, or known as the photon injector, which turns them all back on to make it where the photons are all on for the memory, so it checks victory via the photon being off. It does this until it's all through. Then it transmits to the other memory bank, so it goes repeating through the entire process until it's at the end where it transmits to the screen reset process. Before it does the other reset process, it actually goes to the other memory bank and quickly repeats the entire process we went over just on the other memory bank. And when it's done, it goes to then the screen reset process. The screen reset process is over here. It sends it to this little area as the first step of the screen reset. Now that it has received its transmission, this photon injector transmits to 3 different locations. 1, to where the green marble slab is. 2, to the screen reset, and to the photon faucet acting as our timer for the reset. To understand the next step better, we are going to zoom out a little bit and add the turn flip-flopper, what is part of the reset process. Transmitting from the green marble to the turn flip-flopper as the photon remover, turning off the photon block so it's ready for when the game is fully reset, so whoever can make their turn. At the same time, the red lantern block as the photon remover sends 3 signals to the screen, what will be explained. At the same time, the photon ball is rolling down the conveyor belts to the end destination. The screen receives the 3 signals, 1 to the bottom middle and 2 to the top edges. So now we continue on to our next step, the removing and cleaning of the screen. The photon remover travels down through the screen in each segment, and as we know, because it travels next to it, it turns off what it goes through and whatever's next to it. So the mimics on the outside of the screen turn off at the same time as the photon blocks on the inside turn off as well. Now the photon ball has reached the end of its destination, so the process is now repeated again where it transmits the negative signal back to the other screen and spawns the photon ball. And as the ball travels, the screen gets cleaned up and it repeats this process about 3 times until each side of the screen is now cleared. Now this photon ball has reached the end of its destination. Instead of resetting the screen, because now the screen is reset, it sends the photon remover to both reset caps on the reset button. and it transmits to the master cap removal system, the photon remover, to remove all caps, where it sends in groups of 3 to each side until alternating until the whole thing is reset, like in the demonstration. Now that has been the entire breakdown. I had a lot of fun making it. I'm hoping that you guys now have a greater understanding of how it worked. Well, I'm Loki the Witful, and I hope you all had a good day or night. Goodbye.